Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. We've been on hiatus for a month or so, trying to get out of town and or broiling in the heat here in Texas. But I'm happy to be back today with Lauren McGaughy and to have Lauren join us again. I was trying to remember the last time you were here, but it was probably 2019, I think.
Yeah.
Lauren is an investigative reporter for the Dallas Morning News, where she focuses on state politics and policy. And that really doesn't do justice to the enormous amount of ground that she has covered since coming to Texas in 2014. Most recently, she has returned again. There's a Godfather 3 joke here that I've already made off mic, so we won't do it again. But most recently, she's returned again to covering a story that she has a lot of background and a lot of history with. That is a story of the now suspended Attorney General Ken Paxton and his legal, ethical, political travails. Yeah, and it's a beat that you have spent a lot of time on. So thanks for coming back, Lauren. It's really good to have you back here.
I don't know if I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see you. But
Well, that's awful nice. You have covered Paxton a lot and broken a lot of big news on this story over the years. We can backfill on some of that as we go. I think let's start with kind of the news of the moment this week. And that is the latest filings in the case, most of which came from the defense, from the Paxton side. But there was an interesting filing by the prosecution, by the House managers that we'll talk about. So this past Saturday, August 5th, and we're recording on schedule on Tuesday morning, was the deadline set by the Senate rules for motions to be considered by the quote-unquote court. And I think it's worth even noting at the outset that even the process of that is interesting. So there's a series of deadlines we'll talk about, but the filings will be considered first by the Senate Special Committee on Rules and Procedures for the Court of Impeachment, to use its formal title. And they will report back to the court on what they think. Now, the status of that report strikes me as a little vague. We'll get to that too. So why don't you tell us a little bit, to start with. You and your colleague, Phil Jankowski, wrote a good piece in the Dallas Morning News this week covering those filings and giving us some subtle interpretation of this, I thought, which we can tease out. So tell us, so tell us a bit about what we learned about where the case is, the Attorney General's tactics from those filings.
Sure. Yeah. I think at this point, we know a good bit about what Paxton's defense is shaping up to be, what it's shaping up to look like. And you're right, his lawyers have filed a few dozen different motions. Some of them kind of seem like they overlap, like they've filed multiple motions on why the articles of impeachment should be thrown out for each motion. Different
there was some
arguments.
Cut and paste in those.
For sure. Lots of overlap. And we haven't seen as much from the House managers who are going to be tasked with presenting the case for removing Paxton from office. But what we can see pretty clearly in Paxton's motions to dismiss, of which there are many, is that in many cases he's not actually arguing that the actions he's accused of didn't happen. He's arguing that if they did happen, they were either not illegal, there was something wrong with them, and they are definitely not impeachable offenses. So he's not necessarily saying I did do them, but he's saying, hey, look, these things aren't that serious. They're just, some of this is in the course of business, being an elected official, running a huge state agency. And I think one of the most interesting arguments we saw in these filings from over the weekend was about the bribery allegation against him. So taking a step back, 20 articles of impeachment. They cover a whole slew of things, not just this particular relationship he had with Nate Paul, this Austin businessman who's accused of bribing him, but also his 8-year-old securities fraud cases, and then a handful of kind of quote unquote, you're a bad guy allegations stuffed in at the end, like, dereliction of duty and that kind of thing. But the bribery motion to dismiss that particular article, Phil and I found really interesting because he talks about how, elected officials do a lot of things in the course of a typical day, and that might help some people. It might help a constituent. Constituents help elected officials, maybe not intentionally, maybe intentionally. And there was a great line in there that was like, all of these things I'm accused of, there may be a quid there may be a quo there, but there's no quid pro quo, right? There's nothing to tie everything together to show that I intentionally asked for something from Nate Paul and he intentionally gave it to me with the understanding that we were swapping favors. Right. And so
somewhere
that was
between
super
like
interesting.
Constituent service and palness.
Exactly. Yeah. He even says like, you're basically trying to turn a friendship into something dirty. And I think a really strong argument his lawyers made in that filing is they had a line that said something like, if this is bribery, then anything that an elected official does in the course of their day could also be considered bribery. And I think that personally, I feel like that argument is directed at the senators themselves. I mean, the jurors that are going to determine whether he's removed for office are also elected officials who also have constituents asking them for favors, and their job as an elected official is to serve their constituency, right? So I think they're going to make that argument directly to these guys that like, hey, look, we all do this kind of stuff. It's not dirty. It's not bad. It's just what happens. It's
like really good constituent service.
Exactly.
And I,
if it happened at all,
it's a little jokey, but it is also, I think you raise a really interesting point that was one of the themes of the article. And one of the things I really liked about the article, you had a quote from, I think, a law professor at UNC, maybe. But anyway, there was a line in there that really perfectly captured, I think, what is important, challenging, difficult to understand about this process, and what also makes it difficult to predict. And that's that line that, this is neither a legal process nor a political process. It's a hybrid of the two.
Right.
And, I think one of the things that the point you're making, which I think is an excellent one, that argument about the nature of the relationship with Paul and, the accusation that you're just making the worst possible interpretation appeals to the jury, really underlines the degree to which, the jury is a bunch of elected officials in what is, in its ultimate intention, not a criminal trial, but a political.
Exactly.
And we say political trial, and it sounds like you're talking about the Soviet Union or something. But that
true.
ultimately is what's going on.
It's true, yeah. We were just off.
Not that it's like the Soviet Union, but that it's a political process.
We were just talking off mic about the Ferguson v. Maddox case, which is kind of the only strong legal precedent we have for impeachment. And, this is back.
Of somebody from the executive branch.
Exactly.
Right,
back in, 1917 when Pa Ferguson was impeached. And that went all the way to the state Supreme Court, these questions of whether he could be impeached and when and how and on what charges. And in that, they make it very clear that, like, they say something, the court said something in there about, the crime, the allegation doesn't have to be in the penal code to be impeachable.
Right.
These are two separate and apart things. But that said, the Senate ultimately has the power to determine what is impeachable and what isn't.
Right.
And so they could make it much more of a criminal-like trial if they wanted to. It's totally up to their discretion. And that's kind of where we get to the gray area here is Paxton's arguing that all of these things should be dismissed, that this is a criminal trial, that he hasn't been given his due process, that none of these allegations are real crimes, if they even happened, if he even did them. And we're going to have to see how the senators feel about that. And he is playing directly to them in their understanding of where the line is between, great constituent services and something else, right?
Right. And something a little more nefarious.
Right.
I want to come back to that, to some elements of that point. But, another thing I wanted to ask you what you thought about that, I kind of picked up in reading those the latest big batch of filings. And there was a little bit of this in some of the earlier filings, but it really came up in a couple of the more recent batch. And that is, as you say, there's not much of contesting of the facts of Paxton's actions per se. There's a couple of spots where maybe a little bit they edge into that. But the other thing I thought was very interesting and that I frankly had not thought about much. We were talking, I'm not a lawyer. Sometimes, these things get pointed out to you by lawyers. You go, oh, okay. But, in a couple of those pleadings, or 3 or 4 of them really that I can remember offhand, there's this kind of thing that that the defense attorneys do in the pleadings that say, these guys are really used the wrong language and were sloppy in the way that they put some of these charges together. And, in the same way that I guess, Paxton is innocent till proven guilty, I want to wait and see what the response of the House managers and their lawyers are. But I'm wondering what you made of that.
That was a really interesting argument for sure. An example of that is they said, okay, there's this article of impeachment about these whistleblowers, and these whistleblowers went to the FBI and then they got fired and, said they were retaliated against. And they wrote, they didn't name these whistleblowers. Yeah. So, who are they? We know who they are. We think we know who, come on, we all know who they are. But they didn't explicitly name them. Therefore, the article of impeachment is unconstitutionally vague. And they make that argument for several of them. And I thought that was definitely super interesting. And something in that Ferguson v. Maddox ruling was a little bit, I couldn't really tell whether they were weighing in on how specific an actual article of impeachment needed to be or just how specific impeachment allegations need to be. But there was a line in there about the nature of impeachment is that it's kind of general. Yeah. You're making a general statement about this guy's a baddie or whatever, and he deserves to be out.
Right.
And I wonder if in that instance they were referring to the specific words on the page or just kind of you can be impeached for anything under the sun if the Senate thinks that, it's fine. So that argument about things not being specific enough or them making mistakes, little turns of phrase that maybe aren't quite accurate. Paxton's lawyers also argue that they've misinterpreted state law a few times, that they don't understand, the House managers don't understand what the Attorney General does, what the Attorney General is tasked with requiring to do under state law. That was specific to the Mitty Foundation, arguments of the AG's office, whether it needs to be defending charitable organizations from being taken advantage of, or if they just need to be kind of overseeing them to make sure that the public trust is, strong in those institutions. And, I'm not a lawyer, but reading the law, it doesn't seem to say that the AG's office has to be on the side of the charitable organization. Right. So that was very interesting. But again, it's up to the Senate whether they think, well, it doesn't really matter whether they misinterpreted law or they left out a name. We still think the allegation itself, the underlying allegation, is concerning enough to take up.
Another one I thought was interesting, I would add to that list that and again, I haven't gone, I need to go back and kind of relook at all the various reference points here, was their characterization of the Attorney General opinion versus the informal opinion that they say he issued.
Right.
Which I thought was another interesting piece of that. And interesting in a way because it also intersects this issue of a particular aspect of the jury pool, which is, the position of Senator Hughes in all of this.
For sure. Well, now we have Senator Campbell thrown in a bit. If people want to read our Dallas Morning News exclusive on that. But
we'll talk a little bit about that, because you guys really kind of elevated that, or, shed some more light on the position of Senator Campbell and all this. So tell us a little about that. That was,
just in general, people have to remember that every single one of these senators has some kind of a relationship with Paxton, good or bad, right? They've campaigned for him, they've campaigned against him, they're friends of his, they whatever, right?
They've served with him.
They've served with him, they've given his campaign money, they're whatever. They have been in each other's weddings, all of that kind of thing. But there's been a few concerns raised by, whether it's Democrats or outside groups or whatever, about a handful of them. And Senator Hughes is referenced in one of the articles of impeachment. And then we reported, was it only last week, that this alleged affair that Paxton had with a woman who worked for Nate Paul, that she previously worked for Senator Campbell. By all measures, there's just someone by the same name that worked for Senator Campbell. There's been some reporting from the New York Post about that relationship, and so this employment apparently with Senator Campbell happened before she worked for Nate Paul, and there's no indication at this point that Paxton was involved in any way. But I'm sure people are asking, well, if she worked for Nate Paul immediately afterwards, why did she leave Senator Campbell's office? If this alleged affair did happen, did that play into it? And should Campbell be a juror in this process if has a direct link to someone mentioned in an article of impeachment? But we haven't seen Patrick express any concern with any individual senator's ability to be a juror. Even before Angela Paxton was forced to recuse herself, he didn't express
partially recuse herself.
Partially recuse herself, right. Yeah. He didn't express concern even with her. And so, I don't know. The experts we talked to said they don't see any other senator being asked to not vote on his removal. But again, anything's possible.
It's been one of the really fascinating aspects of this to me, the way that, look, one of the things that's come up in this conversation already, and just to kind of bring it out maybe, is that, one element of that hybrid of the political and the legal in this whole thing is that, there's been no jury constituted relative to the defendant like this in the history of, regular judicial proceedings.
Right.
I mean, the entire Senate, for a lot of the reasons, or most of them, for a lot of the reasons that you just talked about, would be disqualified from any strictly legal judicial proceeding as a juror.
One of the experts said that expressly to us. They said in any other situation, if this was a criminal trial in a court in Texas, none of these people would be sitting on the jury. But this isn't that.
Well, and that's the thing you have, and I think is, whether you're sympathetic to Paxton or hostile to Paxton, it's a kind of thing that you really just have to keep in the back of your mind at all times. And I think, for people that, like you've spent a lot of time as a legislative reporter in that chamber. And it's kind of hard to imagine what the feel in the room is going to be like. For example, should they be discussing, the role of Paxton's alleged affair and the role of Nate Paul in hiring, the person of interest there, as, all of these senators sitting with a colleague who is married and who was, the person that was, that was the wife in all of this.
Right.
I mean, it's
and would they call Campbell as a witness? Would they say, did you know? Would they,
right.
Who knows? I'm for people that haven't spent so much time in that building, the Senate is known as being sometimes frustratingly locked down in terms of oratory and, there's this very strict veneer of collegiality between members, even if they're having a pretty rough debate on the floor. Dan Patrick has tried to maintain a very tight grip on what should and can be said, raised voices, that kind of thing. And so I definitely think that's going to be true for the trial too. He's not going to want things to get out of hand, but he's also faced with these impeachment allegations touching on some very sensitive topics. It's not just business and money and alleged bribes. Like you said, it's personal relationships and marriages, and
it seemed to me, and then in another, pivoting from that part, which I think has been the almost irresistible part, particularly you mentioned the Post article, particularly for people reporting from out of state. It's like, what, his wife's a senator? It's understandably irresistible as a story. I mean, to me, the Hughes situation is in some ways more awkward, not for the attorney general, but maybe a little, but certainly for the lieutenant governor.
For sure. One of the experts we talked to said that the fact that a senator who's going to be a juror in the case is referenced in an article of impeachment, not as a third party, but as someone who's alleged to have directly helped Paxton do the alleged wrongdoing he's accused of doing. I mean, as a fixer of sorts. The expert couldn't believe that person would still be able to vote. And again, any of this can change at any point. I mean, the Senate set the rules that said Angela Paxton can't vote on removal. So I would think that they would have to agree again if they're going to take someone else out of the mix. But that was something that was very difficult to swallow for these impeachment experts we talked to. That sure, they all know him. They're all going to have some relationship with a statewide elected official, but some of this stuff is more concerning.
Right. Well, and the underlying, look, the institutional politics of this are such that, in recent sessions, Senator Hughes has been one of the lieutenant governor's most frequent and reliable exponents in pursuing his agenda.
For sure. And the real thing to watch in this whole trial is Dan Patrick. Dan Patrick is, by all accounts, the most or one of the most astute political minds in this state. He is incredibly intelligent. He is incredibly good at playing the game in front of the camera, behind the camera. I think political observers now, and tell me if I'm wrong, are saying he is the most powerful lieutenant governor we've had since, the ones whose names adorn buildings here in Austin. And he really does loom large over this trial, over that chamber, over the Republican majority in that chamber, and over people specifically like Senator Hughes and others who he's deputized to be kind of his stars in the Senate, and how he feels about the allegations against Paxton bleed into their decision-making process. I mean, it's what everyone's asking. What does Dan Patrick want, right? He's not a juror. He's supposed to be the judge, but he is so incredibly powerful and so astute that we're all asking ourselves that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been one of the key questions all along is, the operational question is, how does he behave as a, presiding officer / judge, given all of these cross currents we've talked about, you just raised, his position, the views of the senators of him and their history with him, and I read the rules to give him quite a lot of latitude.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yes. Dan Patrick is, and he's not a lawyer. As far as we know right now, neither he nor the Senate have retained outside legal counsel. He has lawyers in his office, obviously, but we've asked them repeatedly, have you brought any impeachment experts on, and they haven't to this point at least. And so Patrick and the senators have placed a lot of control over these proceedings in Patrick's lap. And so we're going to have to see how he uses it. And by all accounts, publicly, he's played this very kind of being the parent in the room, I'm not going to comment on this process. It's very serious. It's going to be fair to everyone involved. And I believe in this institution. And he's just been very straight-backed and kind of playing this elder statesman-like role.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that follows from what you were saying a few minutes ago about the role he often plays when the Senate is convened and operating in public, of being the stern parent and not, you're raising your voice.
Exactly. Yeah. And we saw that happen this past session with Roland Gutierrez, and his upset over gun laws, gun restrictions not passing in Texas. And Patrick really came down on him pretty hard for raising his voice on the floor. And I'm sure that if that happens in these proceedings, he might even be even more stern, because this hasn't happened in a million, I said, 100 years, 100 plus years. And he doesn't want it to reflect poorly on him. He's getting older. He's already thinking about legacy, his legacy. You can see it in everything that he does. And I'm sure that he wants to make sure that this is something that reflects well on him when historians look back on it.
And that's, a piece of something we were talking about before we started, and that is the cost-benefit analysis in stark terms that everybody is doing as they consider, quote unquote, the facts of the case. Particularly in the Senate, but in the House too. I mean, everybody involved is trying to figure out how they're going to balance what is clearly a degree of mobilization on Paxton's behalf in certain quarters of the Republican Party, and particularly the activist part of the party.
Right.
Our polling has not been helpful on that, because, what we found for anybody, I don't think, we found that Democrats' views of the justification of the impeachment were pretty predictable.
Right.
But Republicans were split evenly, right? We basically, as people that listen to the podcast, we've talked about it a few times, but, essentially when we said, do you think the House of Representatives was justified or not justified, 31% of Republicans said justified, 30% said unjustified, 39% said they didn't know, kind of jury's out. So the kind of public opinion support you might look to among Republicans, it's often that can be reassuring on some issues, say border security, is just not present or hasn't been thus far.
Well, and, most of the Republicans in the House voted for impeachment. And we've even seen, this week or last week, Jared Patterson, who is by many accounts one of the most conservative, right-wing members of the House, quote, tweeted me and, was like, oh, so first he said he didn't do it, and now he said maybe he did it, but it's nothing's wrong with it. Like, what's up with this guy? That was really surprising to me. This isn't a black and white thing for Republicans. And, we see that in the fact that Abbott, statewide elected officials have not been coming vocal publicly to his aid. He has Donald Trump, which is big for him, and he has Senator Cruz, which is big for him. But people are not willing at this point to expend political capital defending Ken Paxton, and that's really telling.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people that have, there are the handful of people that seem to be most active in defending him are people that have never been or are no longer in office. And the math for them, I think, is different.
It is, yeah.
Before we go on, you mentioned the House, and I don't want to, sell the House short here. Did you find anything interesting in the House motions in response? I thought the cell phone thing I hadn't really noticed was kind of interesting.
I hadn't noticed that either. Yeah, the House managers are arguing that apparently Paxton's team is going to, under the current rules, would be allowed to use their cell phones during the trial, but the House managers and their side wouldn't be able to use it. So if they caught that dichotomy there, that's good on them. We'll have to see. I'd be hard pressed to see why there should be different rules for different side. Yeah. But other than that, we haven't seen much more from kind of the quote unquote prosecutorial side on how they plan to present this. Later in the month, the sides are going to have to present witness lists, and I think that might be the clearest window into how deeply the prosecutors decide to get, is the alleged mistress going to be on that list?
Right.
Is Nate Paul going to be on that list? Or is this really going to be narrowly focused on these whistleblowers? If they keep it narrowly focused, I would be surprised. I mean, this is
It doesn't seem to be what the tactic was.
It doesn't, and I think people would be asking, why didn't you call this person if they don't include them on the list? But I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes, probably too, that we're not seeing.
Sure.
So, yeah, that's what I'm.
Well, that brings
for.
me to a question I want to. We're winding down, but I want to ask you a couple, sort of, reportery questions.
Okay.
So, how much harder has the gag order made it to report this story? And, I'm curious. I'm curious, like how, because, one of the things that was interesting to me, again, on the political side of the defense filings, that huge body of filings, was that, and there was a story, I think, in the Texas Tribune today to this effect, that, the language in the filings that are part of the legal process sort of allows the defense to, in a way, sidestep the gag order by, for lack, this is a gross generalization, by kind of calling bullshit on the House in the filings, but then saying, hey, no, these are just a legal document. We're not opining per se.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. We saw Tony Busby, one of Paxton's lawyers, go on Mark Davis's radio show and just read from the filings, which, like you said, it can be pretty bombastically written.
Yeah.
And
it's
just say, hey,
it's assaultive and insulting to the House.
I'm not violating the gag order because I'm reading from the legal filings. But legal filings are filed with that kind of language all the time. In fact, the prosecutors in Ken Paxton's securities fraud case often use very colorful language over the years in those filings. So I think that's been a really interesting tactic. We haven't seen the House managers. We've kind of seen them shut down their public communications. We were seeing Andrew Murr, writing op-eds, and we were getting quotes pretty frequently from their lawyers, and now they're, well, I can't talk because of the gag order. So, yeah, we've seen the two sides interact with that order very, very differently. And I kind of understand why both of them are doing what they're doing. Paxton needs to play this out in the court of public opinion as much as humanly possible before he gets to the trial date, because if behind the scenes he is not pressuring the jurors, this is the only way they're going to feel pressure to vote a certain way, is if their constituents continue to hear about this, are upset about it, and write to them, call them, threaten not to give them money, and they hear that through the grapevine. So I understand why Paxton's guys are still out there reading pro forma, and why the lawyers want to kind of be very careful. The lawyers on the other side want to be very careful and make sure they're not sticking in Dan Patrick's craw, because they want to start out with a good relationship with him from the outset.
I'm trying to ask this in a way that you can actually answer. What I want to say is, has it also meant, when I asked about whether it was harder to report, does it also mean that people are like not talking to you off the record as much and things like that?
Oh, come on. I'm not going to talk about that.
Well, I'm not asking like who's.
Yeah.
But I mean, because I've been out of town a lot, but, even people that I know that are not elected officials or whatever are pretty reticent to talk.
Yeah.
Even if it's confidential, even if you swear it's off the record. I mean, it does feel to me like, and not everybody, but that people are paying attention to the gag order.
I think,
and it's got to make it a little bit harder.
More so, there's been a chilling effect, let's just say.
Yeah.
And in some way, it's been a little easier to report certain aspects of it because there's not a press conference every day in which Tony Busby and Dan Cogdell are not only reiterating what they just wrote, but then making all these other statements that we have to report on. So there's in some ways less public information out there that we have to deal with. So we have to figure out how to work with that.
Right.
But yeah, people are being careful. I will say people are being careful.
Yeah.
But the gag order is on public statements, so of a certain nature, right? And I actually think some of them are over-interpreting it. You know, Patrick was very clear that he's not saying you can't talk about
utter a word about it.
Yeah, you can't say anything disparaging. You can't share information about, discovery that the other side might not have, or who you're going to call as witnesses. You know, he just doesn't want this thing to be tried before it's tried. Right. So it's already, it's happening anyway. But So
we'll end and I want to end by just saying, look, you've been living with this story for a long time.
Almost 10 years now. Yeah.
And, you took a little bit of a break in terms of being on other beats. But you've been close to this for a long time across a couple of different jobs. Does it feel like you're going to reach a denouement on this? Or are you still in the sense of like, this is just never going to end? I'm just wondering like your sense of it as you're back, because you're kind of back kind of full time on this, right?
This is all I do.
Right.
It's historic, so I would expect no less. And Paxton's also our local guy. He lives in North Texas, but I think so much of it depends on what the trial outcome is. If he's removed, no matter what happens, there's going to be fallout stories. If he's removed, how does that affect the elections? Are people going to be running on that? Is he going to run for something else? Are they going to bar him from ever holding public office? Is he going to challenge that in court? If he does or doesn't get removed, what's that mean for his wife's career? She, by all accounts, is the more outgoing, personable of the pair. And she's already been tied up in some of his troubles because of the alleged affair and this process server. So it's just things over the
Driving
years,
the truck
right?
the day of the serving.
Yeah, and
serving,
but say if he gets removed, does she, or do they Ma and Pa Ferguson this thing, or does she move on and kind of go her own way and say this is my time to kind of be more independent politically, because she is seen as a rising star.
Having that potential,
yeah. So I think for me, I try not to think of it as like, where am I in the reporting process of this story, because they're going to be around, like whether he's removed from office, whether he wins, he's going to be a force, I think, in the election, at least the near-term elections. Whatever happens to him is going to be very impactful for what happens in the elections. If he wins, how do the other statewide elected officials deal with the fact that they did not come out swinging for him?
Right. How does he deal?
And how does he deal with that? Yeah, and he's going to be seen as vindicated, and is he going to be critical of them for not sticking up for him more strongly? I mean, I think it's a story that has legs, and it could. If he remains in politics, this could be a huge boost for him. And so mental health-wise, don't try to anticipate anything, because
all the signs are
all the signs are who knows. I mean, people are asking me, how do you think, what are the tea leaves saying? And I truly do have no earthly idea how this could go, which makes it pretty interesting, and makes me feel like I need to stay pretty nimble mentally, so as not to burn out on it before the news even happens. Yeah,
I mean, and it's a lot.
It is a lot.
There's a lot going on with this, and as we've
he's also under
on.
securities fraud indictment. He's also being sued by a state bar disciplinary committee for his role in the 2020 election. The whistleblower lawsuit that created these articles of impeachment is pending still against his agency. And so, there's 4 or 5 things happening in the background, too, in addition to the impeachment that we didn't even talk about. So
So
a lot happening.
Yeah. So you're in it for a while.
Sure.
We're all in it. We're all in it
We're
for
all
a
in
while.
it, yeah.
But, well, with that, thanks again for coming back, Lauren.
Sure.
And I know you're busy because there's a lot of stuff to read and a lot of people to talk to. Really appreciate you coming back. As always, thanks to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts here at UT Austin. If you found us on one of the podcasting platforms, you'll find some of the data that I mentioned today and all kinds of other stuff at our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. You will, of course, find Lauren McGaughy in the Dallas Morning News very frequently of late for reasons we've talked about. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.